I never thought I would end up in a full-scale war with my homeowners association over something as basic as staying warm during a Minnesota winter. But here we are. It started on a Tuesday morning in late January when I was sitting in my home office, going through quarterly reports for my software consulting business. The temperature outside had dropped to negative 15 degrees, which is brutal even by Minnesota standards. I had my wood-burning fireplace going full blast because my house, built in 1987, has this quirk where the heating system struggles when temperatures dip below zero. The previous owner had warned me about it, and the wood fireplace had become my backup heating source during the worst cold snaps. I heard the doorbell ring just as I was finishing up a video call with a client in California. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman in her early 50s wearing a puffy jacket with fake fur trim and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her blonde hair was styled in that particular way that screams, "I want to speak to the manager," and her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Zachary Thompson?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly who I was. "That's me," I said, wondering what this was about. "Can I help you? I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss a serious violation you're committing." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years and had never had any issues with the HOA. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn maintained, and generally kept to myself. "What violation?" She pointed dramatically at my chimney, where a thin stream of smoke was rising into the frigid air. "That. You're creating excessive smoke emissions that are disturbing your neighbors and potentially violating county air quality ordinances." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. "You're talking about my fireplace. I'm using it to heat my house. It's negative 15 degrees outside. The HOA bylaws clearly state that homeowners must not create nuisances that affect their neighbors' quality of life. Mrs. Henderson next door has complained that the smoke from your chimney is bothering her." Mrs. Henderson was an elderly woman who barely left her house. I found it hard to believe she had complained about anything, but I decided to keep that thought to myself for now. "Patricia, it's the middle of winter. People use fireplaces. That's what they're for." "Not excessively," she shot back. "I've been monitoring your chimney for the past week, and you've had smoke coming out of it every single day." The fact that she had been watching my house for a week sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Again, it's winter. My heating system can't keep up when it gets this cold. The fireplace is necessary." Patricia pulled out a sheet of paper from her clipboard and thrust it at me. "This is a formal warning. You need to cease using your fireplace immediately or face fines. The first fine is $250, and it doubles with each subsequent violation." I took the paper, reading through it quickly. It was full of legal jargon and references to specific sections of the HOA bylaws that I had admittedly never read carefully when I bought the house. "This is ridiculous. You can't stop me from heating my house." "We can and will enforce our community standards," Patricia said primly. "You have 24 hours to comply." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway to her silver SUV parked at the curb. I stood there in the doorway, letting cold air flood into my house, holding this absurd warning letter. My first instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away, but I knew that would not make the problem disappear. Instead, I went back inside, closed the door, and immediately started researching Minnesota property law and HOA regulations. What I found was both encouraging and frustrating. HOAs in Minnesota do have broad powers to enforce their bylaws, but those bylaws cannot violate state or local laws. More importantly, they cannot prevent homeowners from maintaining basic utilities like heat. The problem was that fighting an HOA typically required lawyers, time, and money. Even if I was right, I would have to prove it. I called my neighbor Mrs. Henderson that afternoon. She sounded surprised to hear from me. "Oh, Zachary, hello dear. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. I just wanted to ask you something. Have you been having any problems with smoke from my chimney?" There was a pause. "Smoke? No, I haven't noticed anything. Why do you ask?" "Patricia Hendricks from the HOA said you complained about it." Mrs. Henderson made an indignant sound. "I did no such thing. Patricia came by last week asking if I had noticed anything unusual about your property, and I told her everything looked fine to me. I certainly didn't complain about your chimney. Goodness, we all use our fireplaces in weather like this." I thanked her and hung up, feeling my anger build. Patricia had lied about the complaint, which meant this was personal for some reason. I tried to think if I had ever done anything to offend her, but I could not recall ever having a real conversation with the woman before today. That evening, I kept my fireplace going. I was not going to freeze because of some power-hungry HOA president's manufactured complaint. The temperature was supposed to drop even further overnight, hitting -20 degrees. Without the fireplace, my house would become dangerously cold. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time by certified mail. It was a notice of fine for $250 for continuing to use my fireplace. The letter stated that I had been witnessed violating the warning, and that payment was due within 15 days. I decided to fight back. I drafted a formal response letter citing Minnesota statutes regarding the right to maintain basic utilities and questioning the validity of the complaint. I sent copies to Patricia, the HOA board, and kept one for my records. I also started documenting everything, taking photos of my chimney, recording the outdoor temperature, and noting when I used the fireplace and why. The response came faster than I expected. Patricia called me directly, which surprised me. "Mr. Thompson, I received your letter, and I need to inform you that your arguments are irrelevant. The HOA bylaws are a legal contract that you agreed to when you purchased your property. You are bound by them. The bylaws can't override my right to heat my home during sub-zero temperatures," I said, keeping my voice level. "Then I suggest you use your central heating system like everyone else." "My central heating system can't keep up in extreme cold." The house was built with the fireplace as a supplemental heat source. "That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Thompson. The HOA cannot make exceptions for individual circumstances. If we let you violate the smoke ordinance, we would have to let everyone do it." "There is no smoke ordinance," I countered. "I checked with the county. There are regulations about burning trash and certain materials, but using a wood-burning fireplace for heat is completely legal." Patricia's voice took on an icy edge. "The HOA has the right to create and enforce standards that exceed local ordinances. Our community prides itself on clean air and quality of life. Your excessive smoke violates that standard. Excessive smoke from staying warm. Do you hear how insane this sounds?" "What I hear is a homeowner who thinks he's above the rules. Pay your fine, Mr. Thompson, or we will place a lien on your property." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, realizing this was going to escalate far beyond what I had imagined. Patricia was not going to back down, and she had the full weight of the HOA behind her. Over the next week, the cold snap continued. Every day, I received letters documenting my violations. The fines were piling up. $250, then $500, then $1,000. According to their doubling scheme, I was racking up thousands of dollars in fines for the crime of heating my home. I consulted with a lawyer, an older man named Gerald who specialized in property disputes. He reviewed my case and gave me the bad news. "You're right about the law, Zachary. They can't force you to freeze, but fighting this will cost you more in legal fees than just paying the fines, at least in the short term. HOAs bank on that fact. They know most people can't afford to fight them." "So what do I do?" Gerald leaned back in his chair. "You document everything, keep fighting through their internal appeals process, and we prepare for the possibility of a lawsuit. But I have to warn you, it could take months or even years to fully resolve." I left his office feeling defeated. I could not afford a drawn-out legal battle, and Patricia knew it. This was a war of attrition, and she had more resources than I did. That night, I sat in my living room, fireplace crackling, thinking about my options. The warmth from the fire was necessary, not a luxury. My heating bills were already astronomical, and without the fireplace, they would become unbearable. But more than the money, it was the principle. Patricia was abusing her power, and I could not just let that stand. Then an idea started forming. It was risky, possibly petty, but it might just work. If Patricia wanted to play hardball about heating sources, maybe I could show her exactly what happened when heating became a problem. The Meadowbrook Estates Clubhouse was a source of pride for the HOA. It was a large, modern building where they held community events, board meetings, and social gatherings. Patricia had pushed through a major renovation project the previous year, spending tens of thousands of dollars in HOA fees to upgrade it. The building had a state-of-the-art kitchen, a large meeting hall, and, most relevant to my plan, extensive plumbing throughout. I happened to know, because I had attended a few meetings there before Patricia's time, that the clubhouse's heating system was controlled by a smart thermostat that could be accessed through the HOA's management app. Every homeowner had access to this app to pay dues, submit maintenance requests, and view community information. The thermostat control was supposed to be locked to board members only, but I had discovered months ago, completely by accident, that the security on it was laughably bad. A simple password reset using my email had given me access to features I probably should not have had. I had never done anything with that access. It had seemed like more of a curiosity than anything useful. But now, as I thought about Patricia's crusade against my fireplace, a plan crystallized in my mind. If she was going to fine me for heating my home, maybe she needed to understand what happened when heating stopped working. Minnesota winters were not forgiving, and buildings needed to maintain a minimum temperature to prevent pipes from freezing. If the pipes froze and burst, the damage would be catastrophic and expensive. It was petty. It was probably illegal, and it would definitely cause problems. But after weeks of harassment, mounting fines, and the threat of a lien on my property, I was past the point of caring about playing nice. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. I knew from the community calendar that they typically spent about 2 hours in meetings, sometimes longer if Patricia was on one of her power trips. The forecast showed another cold front moving in, with temperatures dropping to -18 degrees that night. Thursday arrived, and I spent the day wrestling with my conscience. What I was planning was wrong on multiple levels. It was destructive. It would cost the HOA money, and it would definitely make my situation worse if I got caught. But every time I started to talk myself out of it, I would remember Patricia's smug voice on the phone, the stack of fine notices on my desk, and the principle of the thing. At 6 in the evening, I opened the HOA management app on my phone. My hands were shaking slightly as I navigated to the Clubhouse thermostat controls. The system showed the current temperature was set to 68 degrees, typical for an evening when people would be using the building. I changed it to 45 degrees. That was cold, but not quite cold enough. Pipes typically started having problems when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees for extended periods, especially in exterior walls or unheated spaces like the clubhouse's basement mechanical room. Then, I did something more drastic. I found the settings for the overnight schedule and changed them. Instead of the normal nighttime temperature of 60 degrees, I set it to 35 degrees. The system would automatically drop to that temperature at 10 in the evening, well after the meeting would end and everyone would have left. The final step was covering my tracks. I knew the system kept logs, but most people never checked them. Still, I changed my account password and cleared my app cache, making it harder to trace the changes back to me quickly. I hit save and sat back, my heart pounding. It was done. The clubhouse heating would start dropping in a few hours, and by morning, if the temperature stayed low enough for long enough, the pipes would freeze. When they eventually thawed or burst, the damage would be significant. Part of me hoped nothing would happen, that the pipes would somehow survive or someone would notice the temperature drop and fix it. But the larger part of me, the part that was tired of being bullied by an HOA president on a power trip, hoped my plan worked exactly as intended. I tried to act normally that evening, making dinner and watching television, but I kept checking my phone compulsively. Around 9, I looked at the forecast again. -18 degrees, winds making it feel like -30. Perfect conditions for what I had set in motion. The next morning, I woke up to a series of frantic messages in the community app. The first one, posted at 6 in the morning by Patricia herself, read, "Urgent, clubhouse heating system malfunction, building closed until further notice." I felt a mix of guilt and satisfaction as I read through the subsequent messages. Other board members were chiming in, discussing emergency repair services and expressing concern about potential damage. By 9, there was an update from Patricia that made my stomach drop and my smile widen simultaneously. Significant pipe damage discovered in clubhouse, multiple burst pipes in basement and kitchen, building uninhabitable, emergency board meeting via video call tonight at 7. I had done it. The pipes had frozen and burst, exactly as I had intended. The clubhouse, Patricia's pride and joy, was flooded and damaged. The guilt I felt was real, but so was the sense of justice. She had pushed me into a corner and I had pushed back. The video meeting that night was chaotic. I joined from my laptop, my video off and my microphone muted unless I needed to speak. Patricia looked haggard, her usual perfectly styled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was not wearing makeup, and the stress was evident on her face. "The damage is extensive," she began, her voice tight. "We're looking at a minimum of $40,000 in repairs, possibly more depending on what else they find when they start tearing out the walls. Our insurance will cover some of it, but we have a $10,000 deductible, and there's a chance they'll argue this was due to negligence." One of the other board members, a man named Thomas, spoke up. "How did this happen? The clubhouse heating system is brand new. We just had it serviced in November." Patricia's jaw tightened. "The repair technician said the thermostat was set to 35 degrees overnight." The system did exactly what it was programmed to do. Someone changed the settings. The video chat erupted in confused chatter. I stayed silent, watching the chaos unfold. "That's impossible," another board member said. "Only board members have access to those controls." "That's what I thought too," Patricia said. But apparently there was a security flaw in the management app. The company is investigating, but they said it's possible someone else gained access. My heart rate picked up. They were already looking into it. I had known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so directly made it real. Thomas asked the obvious question. "Do we know who did this?" "Not yet," Patricia admitted. "But when we find out, there will be serious consequences. This is vandalism, possibly criminal mischief. We will be pressing charges." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing emergency funds, special assessments to cover the deductible, and timeline for repairs. I listened to all of it, feeling the weight of what I had done settling on my shoulders. This was more serious than I had let myself fully consider. When the meeting ended, I sat in my dark living room, the only light coming from my laptop screen and the fireplace. I had struck a blow against Patricia and the HOA, but I had also created a real mess that would affect everyone in the community. The special assessment they were discussing would mean every homeowner, including me, would have to pay several $100s to cover the repairs. The next few days were tense. The community was buzzing with speculation about who had sabotaged the clubhouse. Some people thought it was an outside hacker, others suspected a disgruntled homeowner, and a few conspiracy theorists even suggested it was an inside job by someone on the board. I kept my head down, continuing my normal routine. I also, defiantly, kept using my fireplace. If anything, the clubhouse disaster had distracted Patricia from her crusade against my chimney smoke. The fine notices stopped coming, and there were no more threatening phone calls. But my relief was short-lived. A week after the incident, I received a knock on my door. This time it was not Patricia, it was 2 police officers. "Zachary Thompson," the older of the 2 officers asked. My mouth went dry. "Yes, that's me. We need to ask you some questions about an incident at the Meadowbrook Estates clubhouse. Can we come in?" I wanted to refuse, to tell them to come back with a warrant, but I knew that would only make me look guilty. Instead, I nodded and stepped aside to let them in. We sat in my living room, the same room where I had made the decision to sabotage the clubhouse heating. The irony was not lost on me. "Mr. Thompson, we're investigating an incident of property damage at your community clubhouse," the younger officer began. "On January 22nd, someone accessed the building's heating system remotely and changed the settings, causing pipes to freeze and burst. The damage is estimated at over $40,000. You know anything about this?" I had prepared for this moment, rehearsing what I would say if questioned. The key was to not lie directly, but to not incriminate myself either. "I heard about it at the board meeting. It's terrible what happened." "Were you aware that homeowners have access to the clubhouse thermostat through the HOA management app?" I knew we had an app for paying dues and things like that. I did not know we could control the thermostat. That was technically true. I had not known until I accidentally discovered it months ago. The older officer leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, we're also aware that you've been having a dispute with the HOA regarding your fireplace use. Multiple complaints, fines, threats of liens on your property. That must have been frustrating." "It's been a difficult situation," I admitted, "but I've been handling it through the proper channels." "Have you?" the younger officer asked. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you had motive and opportunity. You're tech-savvy, you own a software consulting business. Accessing and manipulating a smart thermostat would be easy for someone with your background." I felt sweat forming on my back despite the cool temperature in the room. "I didn't sabotage the clubhouse." "Yes, I'm frustrated with the HOA, but I would not destroy property over it." The officers exchanged a glance. The older one pulled out a notebook. The HOA provided us with access logs from their management app. We're working with the software company to trace the specific account that made the changes. We will find out who did this. Then you'll find out it wasn't me, I said, hoping my voice sounded more confident than I felt. They asked me a few more questions about my whereabouts on the evening in question, home alone, which was not a helpful alibi. Whether I had noticed anything suspicious in the community, no. And if I had any idea who might have done it, no. Another lie. Finally, they stood to leave. Mr. Thompson, we strongly advise you not to leave the area while this investigation is ongoing, the older officer said. If we have more questions, we'll be in touch. After they left, I sat down heavily on my couch, my hands shaking. This was real. This was criminal investigation real, not just HOA drama. If they traced the app access back to me, I could be charged with criminal mischief, vandalism, possibly even more serious charges given the dollar amount of damage. I spent that night barely sleeping, running through scenarios in my head. The app logs would show my account accessed the thermostat, but I had changed my password and cleared the cache. Would that be enough to create reasonable doubt? Or would it just make me look more guilty, like I was trying to cover my tracks? The next morning, I made a decision I probably should have made earlier. I called Gerald, the property lawyer I had consulted about the HOA dispute. I need to talk to you about something serious, I told him. In person, today if possible. We met at his office that afternoon. I closed the door behind me and sat down across from his desk. The police came to see me yesterday, I began. Gerald's expression turned serious immediately. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The harassment from Patricia, the escalating fines, my discovery of the thermostat access, and my decision to change the settings that night. When I finished, Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed deeply. Zachary, do you understand the seriousness of what you've done? This isn't just property damage. Given the dollar amount, this is likely a felony in Minnesota. I know, I said quietly. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was just so angry and frustrated, and I wanted to make a point. You've made a point all right, Gerald said. The question now is what to do about it. Do the police have direct evidence linking you to the thermostat changes? They said they're working on tracing the app access. I changed my password afterward and cleared my cache, but I don't know if that's enough. Gerald rubbed his temples. Let me be very clear about something. If you're charged, lying to the police will only make things worse. However, you also have the right to remain silent and not incriminate yourself. The problem is, you've already spoken to them. I didn't admit to anything. Good, don't. If they come back with more questions, you refer them to me. From this point forward, I'm your attorney, not just for the HOA dispute, but for this potential criminal matter. Understood, I nodded, feeling the full weight of my actions crushing down on me. What had seemed like justified revenge in the heat of the moment now looked like a terrible, life-altering mistake. There's something else you need to consider, Gerald continued. If this does go to trial, your history with Patricia and the HOA could actually help your defense. Provocation isn't a complete defense to property crimes, but it can be a mitigating factor. The jury might be sympathetic to someone who was pushed to the breaking point by unreasonable HOA harassment. So, what do you recommend? For now, we wait. Don't talk to anyone about this, especially not anyone in the HOA community. Don't post anything on social media, don't discuss it with neighbors, and absolutely do not talk to the police without me present. If they do build a case and charge you, we'll deal with it then. I left Gerald's office feeling only slightly better. At least I had legal representation, but I was still facing the possibility of criminal charges. The guilt I had been pushing down started to surface. Yes, Patricia had been unreasonable and abusive in her power, but that did not justify what I had done. I had caused real damage that affected the entire community, not just Patricia. The investigation continued over the following weeks. I would see police cars in the neighborhood occasionally, presumably as they interviewed other residents. The community app was full of updates about the clubhouse repairs, which were even more extensive than initially estimated. The final damage assessment came in at $53,000. Between insurance and the HOA's reserves, homeowners were being hit with a special assessment of $350 each. I paid my assessment along with everyone else, the irony not lost on me that I was helping to fund repairs for damage I had caused. The community sentiment was divided. Some people were angry about the attack on our community, while others seemed almost gleeful that something dramatic had happened in the usually boring suburb. Then, about 3 weeks after the incident, something unexpected happened. I received an email from someone named Linda Garcia, another homeowner in the community. The subject line read, "You're not alone in your fight with Patricia." I opened it cautiously, wondering if this was some kind of trap. The email read, "Zachary, I heard about your dispute with the HOA over your fireplace. I want you to know that you're not the first person Patricia has targeted, and you won't be the last. I've been dealing with her for over a year about my backyard fence. She claims it's 6 inches too tall, which violates the bylaws. I've had it professionally measured 3 times, and it's exactly the approved height, but she keeps issuing fines. I'm now up to over $2,000 in fees. Several other homeowners have similar stories. If you're interested, a few of us are meeting next week to discuss our options. We're thinking about bringing a complaint against Patricia to the board or possibly even seeking her removal as president. Let me know if you want to join us." I stared at the email for a long time. Linda was offering me allies, people who had also suffered under Patricia's authoritarian approach to the HOA. But I was also potentially under criminal investigation. Getting involved in an organized opposition to Patricia could look like further retaliation, which would not help my case if charges were filed. Still, I was curious. I replied to Linda, thanking her for reaching out and asking for more information about the meeting. We exchanged a few emails, and I learned that there were at least 7 homeowners who had ongoing disputes with Patricia, all involving what seemed like petty or manufactured violations. The meeting was held at Linda's house the following Tuesday evening. I debated whether to go, but ultimately decided that if I was going to face consequences for the clubhouse incident, I might as well see this HOA situation through to the end. Linda turned out to be a woman in her late 30s with long, dark hair and a warm smile. Her house was decorated in a cozy, lived-in style that immediately put me at ease. Besides me, there were 5 other homeowners present. A retired couple named Harold and Margaret, a young woman named Sophie who had been fined for having the wrong shade of white on her front door, a man named David who had been targeted for parking his work van in his driveway, and a middle-aged woman named Carol who had been fighting with Patricia over her holiday decorations. We spent the first hour sharing our stories, and a pattern quickly emerged. Patricia seemed to target people randomly, finding obscure or subjective violations in the HOA bylaws, and then pursuing them relentlessly. The fines added up quickly, and anyone who pushed back was threatened with liens or other consequences. "She's turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom," Harold said, his voice bitter. "My wife and I have lived here for 15 years, and we've seen 3 different HOA presidents. None of them were perfect, but Patricia is on another level. She's using the position to bully people and boost her own ego. The problem is, Most homeowners don't pay attention to HOA business, Linda added. They pay their dues, follow the basic rules, and ignore the rest. Patricia was elected because she was the only person who ran for president. Now she's entrenched, and getting rid of her will be difficult. Can't we just vote her out? Sophie asked. We can, but only at the annual meeting in April, Carol explained. And we would need someone to run against her, plus enough votes to win. With apathy being what it is, that's a tall order. David, who had been quiet up to this point, spoke up. What if we brought a complaint to the board? They have the power to remove her if she's violating her duties or acting unethically. The board is full of her allies, Linda said. She handpicked most of them. Thomas is the only one who occasionally pushes back, and even he usually falls in line. The conversation continued, with various strategies being proposed and debated. Eventually, Linda suggested a two-pronged approach. Prepare a formal complaint to the board documenting all of Patricia's abusive behavior, and simultaneously organize a campaign to elect new leadership at the April annual meeting. We need to document everything, Linda said, looking around the room. Every fine, every threatening letter, every unreasonable demand. If we can show a pattern of abuse of power, the board will have no choice but to act, even if they're loyal to Patricia. Everyone agreed to compile their documentation and meet again in 2 weeks. As the meeting was breaking up, Linda pulled me aside. I heard the police question you about the Clubhouse incident, she said quietly. My stomach dropped. How did you know that? Patricia mentioned it at the last board meeting. She's convinced you did it because of the fireplace dispute. Did you? I looked at Linda, trying to read her expression. Was she asking out of curiosity, or was she trying to get information she could use against me? The police asked me some questions, but I didn't have anything to do with it, I said carefully. Linda studied me for a moment, then nodded. Be careful, Zachary. Patricia is vindictive, and if she thinks you're responsible, she'll do everything in her power to make sure you pay for it, whether you actually did it or not. I went home that night with a lot on my mind. The homeowner group gave me hope that Patricia's reign could be ended through proper channels, but Linda's warning reminded me that I was playing a dangerous game. If Patricia truly believed I was responsible for the clubhouse damage, she would not rest until I was punished. The following week brought a development I had not anticipated. I received a certified letter from the HOA, but it was not another fine notice. It was a formal notice of a special hearing before the HOA board regarding my pattern of violations and potential involvement in criminal activity affecting community property. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and the letter stated that the board would determine whether to take additional actions against me, including possible suspension of community privileges and expedited lien proceedings. I was invited to attend and present any defense or explanation I wished to offer. I immediately forwarded the letter to Gerald. He called me within an hour, his voice tight with anger. This is outrageous. They're essentially putting you on trial without any due process. And mentioning potential criminal activity when you haven't been charged with anything is defamation waiting to happen. Can they do this? I asked. Technically, yes. The HOA bylaws allow for disciplinary hearings. But the way they're conducting this, with public accusations before any charges have been filed, crosses a line. I'm going to attend this hearing with you, and we're going to make it very clear that they're treading on dangerous legal ground. The 2 weeks until the hearing crawled by. I tried to focus on work, but it was difficult to concentrate knowing that my reputation and possibly my home were on the line. The community app was buzzing with speculation about the hearing. Someone had leaked information about it, and now everyone knew that I was being accused of sabotaging the clubhouse. The reactions were mixed. Some people defended me, pointing out that I had not been charged with any crime and deserved the presumption of innocence. Others were convinced of my guilt and called for me to be expelled from the community entirely. The whole thing had taken on a circus atmosphere that made my stomach churn. Linda and the others from our homeowner group reached out with messages of support. They offered to attend the hearing and speak on my behalf, which I appreciated but also worried might make things worse. I did not want them to be targeted by Patricia simply for associating with me. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept rehearsing what I would say, how I would defend myself without actually admitting guilt. Gerald had coached me extensively. The key was to focus on the lack of evidence, the presumption of innocence, and Patricia's vendetta against me over the fireplace issue. The hearing was held in a rented conference room at a local hotel, since the clubhouse was still under repair. When I arrived with Gerald, I was shocked to see the size of the crowd. At least 40 homeowners had shown up, packing the room beyond capacity. Some people were standing along the walls, and others were seated in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where Patricia and 4 other board members sat. Patricia's expression when she saw me was a mixture of triumph and disdain. She clearly expected this to be my downfall, a public humiliation that would end with me being driven out of the community. The hearing began with Patricia reading a statement outlining the accusations against me. It was a litany of complaints: the fireplace violations, my refusal to comply with community standards, my hostile attitude toward HOA leadership, and finally, probable involvement in the criminal sabotage of community property. When she finished, the room was silent. Patricia looked at me expectantly. "Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Gerald stood up before I could respond. "I'm Gerald Strauss, Mr. Thompson's legal counsel." Before we proceed, I need to state for the record that this hearing is highly irregular and potentially illegal. My client has not been charged with any crime related to the clubhouse incident. For this board to publicly accuse him of criminal conduct without evidence is defamation per se. Furthermore, the fireplace dispute that precipitated this hearing involves the HOA attempting to prevent my client from heating his home during sub-zero temperatures, which arguably violates Minnesota law regarding habitability and utility access. Patricia's face flushed red. "Mr. Strauss, this is an HOA disciplinary hearing, not a court of law. We have the right to enforce our bylaws." "You have the right to enforce reasonable bylaws in a reasonable manner," Gerald shot back. "What you don't have the right to do is harass homeowners, manufacture violations, and conduct witch hunts based on unproven accusations." The room erupted in murmurs. Several people were nodding in agreement with Gerald, while others looked uncertain. Thomas, the board member who Linda had mentioned occasionally pushed back against Patricia, spoke up. "Patricia, I have to say, I'm uncomfortable with how this hearing has been framed. We're essentially accusing Zachary of a crime when the police investigation is ongoing. That seems premature." "The investigation has been ongoing for weeks with no resolution," Patricia snapped. "This community deserves to know who attacked our property. All evidence points to Mr. Thompson." "What evidence?" Gerald demanded. "Please enlighten us." "What concrete, admissible evidence links my client to the thermostat tampering?" Patricia hesitated, clearly not expecting to be challenged so directly. "He had motive. He was engaged in a dispute with the HOA. He has the technical skills to manipulate the system. And he has refused to cooperate with the investigation." "Motive," Means and opportunity are not evidence, Gerald said. They're speculation. Has the police investigation identified my client as a suspect? Has the app company's security audit traced the thermostat access to his account? Do you have any actual proof? Patricia looked to the other board members for support, but most of them were avoiding eye contact. Finally, she admitted, the police investigation is still ongoing, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Circumstantial evidence is not enough to convict someone in a court of law, and it's certainly not enough to justify this kangaroo court, Gerald said. His voice had risen, and he was clearly angry now. What we have here is an HOA president who has been abusing her authority, targeting homeowners with frivolous violations and excessive fines. My client dared to stand up to that abuse, and now you're trying to destroy him to cover your own misconduct. The room exploded in conversation. People were shouting over each other, some in support of Gerald's accusations, others defending Patricia. I sat quietly, watching the chaos unfold and feeling a strange sense of detachment. Linda stood up from where she was sitting in the third row. "I have something to say," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. The room gradually quieted. "Patricia, you've been targeting homeowners for years with your petty violations and power trips. I've been dealing with your harassment over my fence for over a year. Sophie over there was fined for having the wrong shade of white paint. Harold and Margaret have been fighting you over their mailbox placement. This isn't about Zachary or the clubhouse. This is about you abusing your position and finally facing consequences." Several other people stood up, voicing their own complaints about Patricia's leadership. The hearing had completely derailed from its intended purpose. Instead of putting me on trial, it had become a referendum on Patricia herself. Patricia tried to regain control, banging her gavel and calling for order, but it was useless. The room was in full revolt. Thomas stood up and spoke quietly to Patricia. I could not hear what he said, but her face went pale. Finally, Thomas turned to address the room. "I'm calling for a recess. The board needs to discuss how to proceed. This hearing is suspended for 30 minutes. The board members filed out of the room into an adjacent office space. The crowd did not disperse. Instead, people clustered in groups, talking animatedly. Several homeowners came up to me to offer support or share their own stories of conflicts with Patricia. Gerald pulled me aside. "This is good for us. The focus has shifted away from you and onto Patricia's leadership, but don't get complacent. We still don't know how the police investigation will turn out." "Do you think they'll drop the accusations against me?" I asked. "I think they don't have a choice at this point. They've lost control of the narrative. If they try to continue the hearing, it will only make things worse for them." When the board returned, Patricia looked shaken. Thomas was the one who spoke. "After discussion, the board has decided to suspend this hearing pending the outcome of the police investigation. We will not be taking any additional disciplinary action against Mr. Thompson at this time." He paused, glancing at Patricia before continuing. "Furthermore, the board recognizes that there have been concerns raised about HOA enforcement practices. We will be conducting a review of all active violation cases to ensure they are being handled fairly and in accordance with our bylaws." It was not a complete victory, but it was close. The hearing was over, and I was not facing immediate consequences. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but the other board members were clearly done with the situation. As people filed out of the conference room, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The hearing had gone better than I could have hoped, but the police investigation was still hanging over my head. And I knew Patricia would not forget or forgive what had happened today. Over the next few weeks, things in the community changed dramatically. Word spread about the hearing and the accusations against Patricia. The homeowner group that Linda had organized grew to over 20 members. They compiled a comprehensive document detailing Patricia's pattern of harassment and abusive practices, which was submitted to the board and circulated among the community. The pressure on Patricia became intense. Thomas and another board member, a woman named Rachel who had remained mostly silent during my hearing, began to publicly question some of Patricia's decisions. The review of violation cases that Thomas had promised revealed that nearly 30 homeowners had active disputes with the HOA, many of them involving questionable or subjective violations, similar to my fireplace issue. Then, about 6 weeks after the Clubhouse incident, I received a call from one of the police officers who had questioned me. "Mr. Thompson, this is Officer Davidson. I wanted to inform you that we've concluded our investigation into the Clubhouse vandalism." My heart stopped. "And?" "We were able to trace the thermostat access to a specific account in the HOA management system. It wasn't yours." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Relief, confusion, and disbelief all washed over me at once. "It wasn't." "No. The access came from an account registered to a Margaret Chen. We spoke with Mrs. Chen, and she admitted to changing the thermostat settings. She said she did it as retaliation against the HOA for years of harassment. She claims she didn't realize how much damage it would cause." Margaret. The name rang a bell, and then I realized she was the retired woman who had been at Linda's meeting, part of the couple being targeted over their mailbox placement. "Mrs. Chen is being charged with criminal damage to property," Officer Davidson continued. "Given the dollar amount of the damage, it's a felony. I wanted to inform you because I know there was speculation in your community that you might have been responsible. You're no longer a person of interest in this case." After he hung up, I sat in stunned silence. Margaret had done it. Sweet, quiet Margaret, who looked like she would not hurt a fly, had sabotaged the clubhouse. And I had spent weeks terrified that I would be caught for a crime I had actually committed, only to find out someone else had done the same thing and beaten me to it. The irony was almost too much to process. I had changed the thermostat settings that night, but apparently someone else had done it too, either just before or just after me. The system logs must have recorded Margaret's access instead of mine, or perhaps hers had been more extensive and obvious. I should have felt relieved. The police investigation was over and I was cleared. But instead, I felt terrible. Margaret was facing felony charges for doing essentially what I had also done. She was going to be punished while I got away with it through sheer luck. The news about Margaret spread through the community quickly. Reactions were mixed. Some people were shocked that such a sweet old lady would do something so destructive. Others, particularly those in Linda's homeowner group, understood exactly why she had done it. I attended the next community meeting where Margaret's situation was discussed. Harold, her husband, stood up and spoke passionately about the years of harassment they had endured from Patricia. Their mailbox, which had been in the same spot for 15 years, was suddenly deemed too far from the curb by 4 inches. Patricia had demanded they move it and fined them repeatedly when they refused. The fines had accumulated to over $3,000, and Patricia had started lien proceedings against their home. "My wife is a good woman," Harold said, his voice breaking. "She's lived in this community peacefully for 15 years. Patricia pushed her to the breaking point. What she did was wrong, but she was driven to it by months of relentless harassment." The meeting was emotional and tense. Patricia tried to maintain that Margaret should face the full consequences of her actions, but she was shouted down by angry homeowners. The tide had fully turned against her. 2 weeks later, At an emergency board meeting called by Thomas and Rachel, Patricia was voted out as HOA president. The vote was 3-2, with Patricia herself voting against her removal and one loyalist board member supporting her. Thomas was appointed interim president until the April annual meeting. Patricia's removal changed everything. Thomas immediately suspended all ongoing violation cases pending individual reviews. My fireplace fines were voided completely, as were Linda's fence fines and dozens of others. The HOA entered into negotiations with Margaret's lawyer to drop their civil claims against her in exchange for her resignation from the community and an agreement to make partial restitution. I felt I had to do something about Margaret's situation. She was facing criminal charges for a crime that I had also committed, even if the evidence only implicated her. I met with Gerald to discuss my options. "I need to know something," Gerald said, looking at me seriously. "Did you also change the thermostat settings that night?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I did it out of anger and frustration. But then Margaret got caught instead of me. I can't let her take the fall alone." Gerald leaned back in his chair, thinking. "If you come forward now, you'll be confessing to a crime. You could be charged as well." "I know. But it's the right thing to do. Margaret shouldn't suffer for something we both did." "There's another option," Gerald said. "We could work on Margaret's defense without you confessing. We can argue that she was provoked by Patricia's harassment, seek a plea deal for a lesser charge, and try to get her probation instead of jail time. That way you don't incriminate yourself, but we still help Margaret." I thought about it for a long time. The coward's way out was to stay silent and let Gerald help Margaret while I remained safely anonymous. The brave way was to confess and face consequences. But there was also a middle path. Using what I knew about Patricia's harassment to build the strongest possible defense for Margaret without putting myself in legal jeopardy. In the end, I chose the middle path. I worked with Linda and the homeowner group to compile every piece of evidence we had about Patricia's abusive behavior. We documented the harassment campaigns, the escalating fines, the threats of liens. I provided my own records of the fireplace dispute, showing the unreasonable demands and Patricia's admission that she had fabricated the neighbor complaint. All of this material was turned over to Margaret's defense attorney. The argument was simple. Margaret had been subjected to years of harassment that amounted to a campaign of targeted abuse. While her actions were wrong, they were the result of extreme emotional distress caused by someone in a position of authority systematically tormenting her. The prosecutor, faced with a sympathetic defendant, substantial evidence of provocation, and a community that largely supported Margaret, agreed to a plea deal. Margaret pled guilty to misdemeanor criminal mischief and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 100 hours of community service, and partial restitution of $5,000 to the HOA. It was a far better outcome than the felony conviction and potential jail time she had been facing. Harold thanked me personally after the sentencing hearing. "I know you helped gather the evidence for Margaret's defense. You didn't have to do that, especially given your own situation with Patricia. Thank you." I felt guilty accepting his thanks, knowing that I had also sabotaged the clubhouse, but had escaped any consequences. Still, I was glad Margaret's outcome had been as good as it was. The April annual meeting brought major changes to the HOA. Thomas ran for president officially and won easily. Linda and 2 others from our homeowner group ran for board positions and were elected. The new board's first order of business was a comprehensive revision of the enforcement procedures to include checks and balances, preventing any future abuse of power. They also reviewed the bylaws themselves, eliminating or clarifying subjective provisions that had been used to target homeowners. The smoke ordinance that Patricia had used against me was completely removed, with the board acknowledging that fireplace use for heating purposes was a fundamental right. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal, or at least a new normal. Patricia moved out of the community within a few months, selling her house and leaving Minnesota entirely according to rumors. Without her presence, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood lifted. I continued to use my fireplace whenever necessary, and no one ever complained again. The clubhouse was fully repaired and reopened, though I always felt a twinge of guilt when I saw it. I was the only one who knew the full truth about what happened that night. Two separate homeowners, pushed beyond their limits, had both decided to sabotage the heating system. One got caught, one did not. I stayed involved with the HOA in a limited capacity, attending meetings and serving on a bylaws revision committee. Linda and I became friends, bonded by our shared experience of fighting back against Patricia's tyranny. She never asked me directly if I had been involved in the clubhouse incident, and I never volunteered the information. About a year after everything happened, I ran into Harold at the grocery store. We chatted for a bit, and he mentioned that Margaret was doing well. She had completed her community service and was rebuilding her life. "You know," Harold said, "Margaret has always maintained that she didn't fully understand what would happen when she changed the thermostat. She just wanted to cause an inconvenience, not tens of thousands of dollars in damage." I believe her. My wife isn't a vindictive person. I nodded, thinking about my own motivations that night. I had known exactly what I was doing and what the likely consequences would be. Margaret might have acted impulsively, not fully considering the outcome. In a way, I was more culpable than she was. "I'm glad she's doing better," I said sincerely. "We both are." And honestly, as horrible as the whole situation was, it did lead to positive change. Patricia is gone, the HOA is functioning better, and people are more engaged in community governance. Sometimes something bad has to happen to shake things up and expose the real problems. I thought about his words a lot after that conversation. He was right that the clubhouse incident, terrible as it was, had been a catalyst for necessary change. Patricia's abuses had been exposed, homeowners had rallied together, and the HOA had been reformed. But that did not erase the fact that a crime had been committed, or that Margaret had suffered consequences for actions that I had also taken. I lived with that guilt, a secret I would probably carry for the rest of my life. Every time I started a fire in my fireplace, I was reminded of the chain of events that had led to that cold January night when I had decided to take revenge. It had seemed justified in the moment, but looking back, I could see all the ways things could have gone differently if I had just been patient, organized community opposition sooner, or sought legal remedies more aggressively. The experience taught me a lot about power, justice, and consequences. Patricia had abused her position of authority, wielding HOA bylaws like weapons against anyone who did not submit to her will. But my response, while understandable on a human level, had been wrong. I had damaged property, cost my community money, and contributed to a situation that resulted in criminal charges against another person. The fact that I had escaped legal consequences did not make me innocent. It just made me lucky. Margaret had been unlucky, but even in her misfortune, she had retained her dignity and her moral standing in a way that I had not. She had owned what she did, accepted responsibility, and moved forward. I had hidden, let someone else take the fall, and benefited from the reforms that came about partly because of her actions. 2 years after the incident, I was sitting in my living room on another cold winter night, fireplace blazing without any concern about complaints or fines. The house was warm and comfortable, and I was reviewing financial reports for my business, which had grown substantially. Life was good, objectively speaking, but I thought about Margaret often, wondering if she still struggled with what had happened or if she had truly moved past it. I thought about Patricia too, whatever had become of her in whatever new place she had landed. Had she learned anything from the experience, or was she out there somewhere, terrorizing another HOA community? And I thought about myself, about the man I had been on that angry January night and the man I was now. I liked to think I had grown, that I had learned to handle conflicts better and to think through consequences more carefully. But I also knew that under the right circumstances, pushed to the right breaking point, any of us were capable of doing things we never thought we would do. The HOA dispute and everything that followed had shown me that communities are fragile things, held together by rules and social contracts that only work when people act in good faith. When someone like Patricia abused their authority, the whole system became corrupted. But responding to corruption with more wrongdoing just created cycles of harm that affected innocent people. If I could go back and do things differently, I would. I would have organized the homeowner opposition earlier, brought in legal help sooner, and worked within the system to remove Patricia through proper channels. The reforms that eventually happened could have occurred without the Clubhouse disaster, without Margaret's criminal record, and without the community being torn apart. But I could not go back. I could only move forward, carrying the knowledge of what I had done and trying to be better. I stayed involved in HOA governance, making sure that the reforms Linda and Thomas had implemented remained in place, and that no future president could accumulate the kind of unchecked power Patricia had wielded. I also quietly helped Margaret and Harold where I could. When Harold mentioned they were struggling financially with the restitution payments, I anonymously paid off the remaining balance through a community assistance fund. When Margaret expressed interest in getting more involved in community volunteering after her probation ended, I supported her nomination to several committees. It was not enough. Nothing could truly make up for the fact that she had faced consequences, while I had not. But it was something, a small attempt to balance the scales in whatever way I could. The fireplace continued to burn on cold nights, keeping my house warm and comfortable. Patricia's crusade against my chimney smoke seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, though it had been less than 3 years. The smoke drifting up from my chimney was no longer a symbol of defiance or a source of conflict. It was just smoke, doing what smoke does, rising into the winter sky and dispersing into nothing. Sometimes I wondered if Patricia ever thought about her time as HOA president, about the power she had wielded and lost. Did she see herself as the victim, unfairly attacked by ungrateful homeowners who did not appreciate her efforts to maintain community standards? Or did she have any recognition of how her actions had harmed people and corrupted the very community she claimed to be protecting? I would never know the answer to those questions, and maybe it did not matter. Patricia was gone, the HOA was reformed, and life in Meadowbrook Estates had improved for everyone. The cost had been high property damage, legal troubles, community strife, and Margaret's criminal record, but the changes were real and lasting. As for me, I had learned that righteous anger does not justify wrongful actions, that revenge feels satisfying in the moment but leaves bitter aftertastes that linger for years, and that the true measure of character is not what we do when we're pushed to our limits, but how we live with those choices afterward. The fire crackled in the hearth, warm and steady, just as it had on that night when everything changed. But I was different now, shaped by consequences both faced and escaped, by guilt both earned and unresolved. The smoke from my chimney rose into the dark Minnesota sky, carrying with it the heat from my fireplace and the weight of secrets I would carry alone. And life went on, as it always does, in the quiet suburbs where homeowner associations govern and sometimes overstep, where neighbors clash and sometimes reconcile, and where the line between justice and revenge is thinner than any of us would like to admit. I had crossed that line once, on a cold January night, and I would spend the rest of my life living with what happened afterward. The clubhouse was repaired, the community was healed, and I remained, warm and safe in my home, haunted by the ghost of a crime that someone else had been punished for, while I had simply gotten away with it.